Thank you for coming this evening. Please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 as we're beginning in verse 6 this evening. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 6. Join us, please. We're continuing the study of Paul's instructions to the Corinthian congregation that was having struggles with a number of problems that he's trying to help them with, and answering some questions, in particular chapters 8 through 10. He's discussing questions that they'd ask him about eating meats offered to idols. And he discusses matters of liberty and enlarges the discussion to include related topics. So chapter 8 was talking about eating meat in an idol's temple, and chapter 9, he then discusses financial support of preachers and his exercise of liberty in regard to that. And now in last part of chapter 9 and into chapter 10, he's discussing self-control and the danger of sin with applications to idolatry, and he'll talk about eating meats offered to idols in discussing then in the conclusion of chapter 10. And I remind you of special assignments that we are working on besides what's in the book. And I want you to list the lessons you've learned from this study. I call it Matters of Liberty, but discussing about eating meats offered to idols and the principles we're studying. And I've revised a little bit the second assignment to make it maybe more clear. I want you to make a list of specific examples of matters of liberty referring to things that we might need to be willing to forego to help other people to be saved, and that you would like the class to discuss. So if you give me those your list there, and I can prepare a list for others to get ready. So as we discussed last time, the last part of chapter 9, and got into the beginning of chapter 10, he was talking about the need for sacrifice and self-control. He used the illustration of athletes who use self-discipline and sacrifice in order to win, but they're winning a corruptible crown, something temporary. But as Christians, we need to exercise self-control and make sacrifices to receive the crown of life, the incorruptible crown. And so then at the end of that section, right at the beginning of chapter 10, we have a discussion of Israel, lessons we can learn from them about the need for self-control and being willing to sacrifice in order to overcome sin. It's going to make applications to idolatry as we go through that. So that's where we were at the end of our study last time. That brings us into chapter 10. Questions or discussion before we go on this evening? All right. So the first 5 verses in chapter 10, how does he describe Israel? What does he say about the nation of Israel in the first 10 verses? 5 verses, excuse me, the first 5 verses that we studied last time. What did we learn about Israel in those first 5 verses from last time? Yeah.
Well, even though they started out following Moses and eating the same spiritual food, drinking the same spiritual drink, but after that they sinned, and so God was not pleased with them and scattered their bodies in the wilderness.
Okay. So the lesson we tried to emphasize was that Israel had a covenant relationship with God. They were God's people. They had committed themselves to serve Him and accepted their responsibilities, but they didn't fulfill them. They didn't do what they said they should do. Now, he's going to give examples, beginning in verse 6, of their failures, but his application is going to be to us. So we see the application he makes, beginning in verse 6, that these are lessons to us, but then he'll look at some specific examples as he goes through the following verses. So let's go ahead and read then verse 6 through 13. I'd like to read chapter 10, verse 6 through 13. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6 through 13, please. Bill, please, verse 6 through 13.
And being ready to punish all disobedience with your obedience is fulfilled.
Okay, excuse me, Bill, are you in the right place here? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6 through 13.
I started.
Okay. That's okay. Let's somebody else get it. That's okay. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6 through 13. See, Neil, can you take that for us, please?
Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. Do not become idolaters, as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted, and were destroyed by serpents. Nor murmur, as some of them also murmured, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, on whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore, let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. But with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it.
Okay. So as we look back at verse 6 then, what application does he make to us in verse 6? What's his application that he's making to us in verse 6? And we're reading about question number 5. What's the application to us? Frank?
The way they were and how they suffered, how they were punished, are examples for us.
Okay. So it's an application to us. And in the context, it's an application to the Church of Corinth in the discussion of things offered to idols, eating of meats offered to idols. The lesson for us is they lusted, they did things they shouldn't do, they failed to keep their commitment to the Lord. We need to learn from that and not lust after evil things and not fail to keep our commitment to the Lord. So that's the application that he's making. Okay, comments, discussion on verse 6? Okay, so what Paul is doing here is teaching us that we can learn from examples. In particular, we can learn from the Old Testament. It's the Old Testament, but that doesn't mean it has no value to us. There's lessons for you and me from the Old Testament. One lesson we need to learn is we need to be faithful. If we don't, we fall away like the people of Israel did. Okay? So question number 6, then I ask you, what is lust? And can you give some examples of Israel lusting? Steve?
Uncontrolled desire.
Well, it's desire. And in general, it's negative. Not always, but generally it's negative. In which case, then it's not properly controlled. So it's a lust, a desire for something that we should not be lusting for. So I ask you for some examples. What would be some example you might think of, one or more, that Israel lusted when they should not have? Think of examples for that. Question number 7 yet. 6 rather, 7, question 6. But have an example, Terry?
Well, when they wanted meat, something besides the manna, and God gave them the doves, but they weren't controlled about that. They just lusted after it to the point that they made themselves sick, trying to eat more and more and more. Okay,
and not only that, other comments on the lusting aspect of it. Okay, and it seems to me, Terry, it's not just the fact that they ate so much, but the fact that they weren't satisfied with what God had given them in the first place. There was a lack of appreciation for what God had given. Frank, did you have a comment?
There was a comment made that they desired the foods that they'd known in Egypt, but they were poor slaves in Egypt, so I can't imagine that they had a lot of delicacies in Egypt.
Right, but even so, they lacked appreciation for what God is giving them, having delivered them from slavery and led them out of captivity. Now they're thinking about it was better back then. And we'll talk some more about that. So it was a lust in the sense that they were desiring something without appreciating what God had given them. Okay, other comments on their lust and the lessons we should learn from their lust. Terry?
Well, Achan is another example. When he wanted the Babylonish garments and the gold, things they were not, that God had not given them, had told them they could not have.
Okay, so Achan took the spoils from the destruction of Jericho, spoils that were to have been dedicated to God, but he took it for himself because he lusted after it. He desired what he should not. Okay, so there's lots of examples we could use, and the point is that the people were not keeping their covenant responsibilities to the Lord. And the lesson for you and me is we need to then make sure that we keep our commitment, that we don't desire things other than what God has provided us and fail to serve him faithfully. Other comments or discussion on examples, Steve?
In Exodus 32, 1 through 6, referencing the golden calf, they were lusting after a tangible God.
Okay, now we're going to talk more about the calf in just a minute. So let's look at verse 7. Got questions or discussion on verse 6 before we move on to 7? Okay. Think about the applications to eating meats offered to idols, but let's look at verse 7 then, and the next example that he gives. And what is that in verse 7? And now we're on question number 7. And now it's question 7. I ask you to go through the list that he gives and discuss each of them. So we'll talk about verse 7 first of all. What was the sin in verse 7? Karen?
Exodus 32:6 says, it's a quote, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play after they had built the golden calf.
All right, so verse 7 is specifically talking about their idolatry with the golden calf because it quotes the passage from Exodus 32, verse 6, which referred to their worshiping the golden calf. Okay? Comments on the worship of the golden calf? What happened? Okay, Karen, go ahead.
Well, I think an interesting thing about it is that they said this was God who brought them out of Egypt. They tried to relate it to God, but God had specifically said you can't have idols. They weren't worshiping God the way God wanted them to. They built an image to worship.
Okay. All right, so they were worshiping God by means of an image which he had forbidden. What else was involved? It describes more about it. What else was involved as it describes it in this verse and in the passage in Exodus 32? What did they do in their worship to this idol? Neil?
While Moses was up on the mountain with God, the people became restless and asked Aaron, "Where's Moses?" and gave up on him. And Aaron asked for all their gold, and he put in the fire, and it says, out come a calf, and then they started worshiping that.
All right, so first of all, the fundamental problem to begin with was they made this calf, this golden calf, which God had forbidden. Instead of what God had told them to do, they violated his covenant by worshiping the calf. That's the fundamental thing. But there's more described to it. How did they worship the calf? What did they do? What does it say they did in worshiping the calf?
Dancing and singing.
Okay, it says that they ate and they drank and they rose up to play. When you go back to the account in Exodus 32, it tells you that the play was singing and dancing. Okay? Now, I think there's several important things for us to observe about that. But questions or discussion from your view on the sin of idolatry as in verse 7. Do you have comments on that? Okay? What does this tell us about idol worship? What do we learn about idol worship in this example? And we're going to see more in other examples as we go along. Actually, the next one, verse 8. What do we learn about idol worship here, Frank?
It always seems to cater to their physical lusts.
Okay, exactly. Worshipping idols was not at all the self-sacrificing dedication and glory to God that we think of as worship. The idolatry so often involved immorality, just doing what pleased them. So they would have a big feast, and they would, as it says, eat and drink, and get up and play. It was fun. It was fun and games to please them, but it was also immorality as involved in the dancing. Now, not all Old Testament dancing was immoral. Some of it was actually done in worship to God under the Old Testament. But the kind of dancing described here was not the kind of dancing that would be acceptable to God. And it helps us to understand that sometimes dancing is suggestive, sexually suggestive. But when the people worshiped their idols, sex was a part of it. We'll see more about that in the next verse 8, which to our minds is just so incomprehensible. But that was the attraction of it. You could do what you wanted to do, whatever you wanted to do, and it's okay because you're worshiping your God. This is your way of honoring your God, lewdness and sexual suggestiveness, but it's okay in the name of your God. And so, think about that in terms now of the instruction to these Corinthians who came out of that kind of idolatry, who left that worship, and now are saying it's okay for us to go into the idol's temple and eat meat offered to the idol. Understand what's going on. And to me, at least, it helps me understand the problem that Paul is having to deal with these people. It's not just a simple matter of eating some meat that's been offered to an idol. There's a lot more involved in the worship of idols that he needs to get them to understand that they don't have a right to participate in. Other commentary discussion on the example in verse 7 and how it helps us to understand the problem that the people were facing. The next one is verse 8, then, which relates to it. What was the problem in verse 8? The sin in verse 8 was what? Frank.
The sexual immorality that some of them did.
Okay. Sexual immorality or fornication. In one day, 23,000 fell. Now that helps us know there's a particular example, a particular incident he's talking about here. What incident was this when they committed fornication and 23,000 fell? What example was that in the Old Testament? He's identifying a particular case by the number. Sure.
It's when they committed sexual immorality with the women of Moab, that Moab sent out to tempt them on purpose because Balaam had suggested that was a good way to get God angry at them.
Okay, so this goes back to Numbers chapter 25. And Balak, king of Moab, had tried to hire Balaam to curse the people, and God wouldn't let him curse the people. So, some background information, you go into Revelation 2:14 and other passages. Balaam then encouraged them to get the people to worship their idol by encouraging them to commit fornication with the women of Moab and Ammon. And then God would be angry with them and God wouldn't protect them anymore. This is Numbers 25, and there's other passages that talk about it, Numbers 31 and Revelation 2 and so on. So, again, fornication was a part of the idol worship. They seduced them, they led them into their idol worship by sexual attraction. Okay? And so, tie it back to verse 7, and we see that this playing, eating, and drinking and so on was satisfying the people's desire for whatever they wanted to do, including immorality and worshiping their gods. Okay, other comments? All right, now, from what I understand, Corinth, the people in Corinth knew about this kind of thing. The temple in Corinth allegedly had hundreds of prostitutes. as part of their worship to their idols in the temples. So when Christians said, oh, it's a matter of liberty, I can go in the temple and I can eat the meat offered to the idol. Well, you may call it a matter of liberty, but look at what you, not only, the problem is not just what you're subjecting other people to by your influence, it's also what you're subjecting yourself to. The influence you're putting yourself under, going here where there's all this immorality and wickedness going on. You say, well, I won't do the fornication, I won't do the immorality. But look at the temptation that you're submitting yourself to. Not only are you tempting other people to think it's all right to go, but you're subjecting yourself to all this other wickedness at the same time. And it seems to me like Paul is adding, I think I see here, Paul is adding another reason why they had no business being in those idol temples, eating that meat offered to idols. It's not just a matter of chapter 8. You may tempt somebody else to sin. It's also a matter, you may tempt yourself to sin when you go there. So stay away. Don't be there. When you understand the worship that's involved, then you had a better idea, it seems to me, of the problem that Paul is trying to deal with here. I hope that's helpful. Comments? Comment.
With that idea, in 1 Kings chapter 12, Jeroboam set up 2 calves for the people to worship so they wouldn't have to go clear to Jerusalem. And in that is what I put down here. And back with Aaron, he built that golden calf. These men caused other people to sin.
Okay.
And bringing that about for them to do, then they sinned in following in that way.
And we begin to see then the seduction, the attraction of this idol worship, why it was so hard for Israel to avoid it, and why Paul is so concerned about them. If the Corinthians, having come out of that kind of thing, go back into it saying, well, we won't do that kind of stuff, but we will do this, this, and this, because this is okay. All right? Other comments or discussion on through verse 8? Anybody? Okay, now verse 9. What other sin does he describe that they were guilty of in verse 9? This is question number, well, we're still on question 7, describing the different of sin.
They tempted Christ by violating God's law.
All right, so they tempted Christ. But again, he tells us some more about it so we know what particular incident it was. What does he say about that incident he's talking about that helps us to know what case this was in the Old Testament? Verse 9. Karen?
It's Numbers 21, 6 to 5 and 6, where the people complain about having no food and no water and are so loath this worthless bread, the manna. So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of them died.
Okay. So this is another example, going back to our discussion earlier in verse 6 about lusting after things they shouldn't have, where they wanted something beside them. They got tired of the manna. Rather than appreciating God's blessing to them, they wanted something else. And God sent serpents to destroy them. And do you remember what, well, many of them died. And do you remember what the solution was? What solution did God give for those who were dying from the biting of the serpents? Remember? Terry?
Put the serpent up on a pole and they'd look towards the serpent.
Okay, a brass serpent, a bronze serpent, that if they looked at that, they would be healed. Okay, so he's talking about a particular incident, another particular situation. Okay? Comments, discussion on that case in verse 9. Now, Jesus refers back to this incident in Matthew chapter 4. When he was being tempted, the devil was tempting him to jump off the pinnacle of the temple in order to see whether or not God would protect him. And Jesus said, you should not tempt the Lord your God. So you have the, or maybe it's not the same example, but the same concept. Don't tempt God. So in what ways could people be guilty of tempting God? And what might this have to do with the Corinthians? In what sense was this tempting God? We see it was wrong, but why was it tempting God? Why does it keep calling it tempting, well, tempting Christ? Why does he call it tempting Christ? Had you thought about that when you studied it, Frank?
Well, Christ died for them. Christ died for the souls of all men. And by violating the law, ignoring that salvation is a temptation to God, to Christ, to judge them to destruction, as he had, as the example that the people were destroying before.
Okay. All right, other comments? All right, so is Jesus jumping off the temple, pinnacle of the temple? It seems to me like the idea is, I'm going to get to do what I want to do and see if God will take care of it. And it seems to me, and protect me, even though I've done something that he really never told me to do. And that seems to me to be the idea here too. We'll do what we get to do and test God that he'll take care of us. And that seems to me to be similar to what the people in Corinth were wanting to do. Well, okay, maybe there's problems in going into the idol's temple, maybe there's this problem, that problem, but God will take care of it. So it was in effect testing God. Will God take care of me? God has never promised to take care of people, no matter who they are, when they're doing things he never told them to do. Okay, so you can't make up your own mind what you want to do and foolishly subject yourself to temptation and say, well, God will take care of this. God, no. But Paul is trying to get them to see, you're putting yourself in a position where God has never promised to protect and care for you. And to do that is to tempt God, to not show proper respect for God and his instruction. That seems to me to be involved in what he's talking about. I think what he's talking about ties back again and again to the discussion in the context of eating meats offered to idols. Other comments on verse 9. Okay, how about 10? What was the sin in verse 10? Frank.
There are complaints that every blessing they received, after a while they complained about what they didn't have.
Okay, and not getting their way.
Not getting what they wanted, the way they wanted.
Right, exactly.
And that's what people do sometimes today.
Okay.
When things don't go their way, then they want to blame God.
So, murmuring, complaining, depending on your translation. They wanted things their way, and when things didn't go their way, complaining over and over and over again. All these situations we've been talking about, and many more that we could talk about, Israel was complaining. God wasn't doing things the way they wanted things to be done. Okay? So they wanted to do what they wanted, and God should take care of it. God should accept it. It should be okay. Give some examples. There's lots of examples. I'm going to give some specific examples where they did this. Murmured and complained. We talked about the manna already.
Well, I was thinking of the manna and the food in Exodus 16, and Moses says to the people, this shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to fulfill you, that the Lord hears your murmuring, which ye murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord.
Okay.
So Moses told them.
So that was one example of the murmuring, was with the manna. What else? There's other examples of it, lots of them actually. But think of others. Terry?
Well, they murmured about Moses bringing them out of Egypt, and that, what did you bring us out here to die in this wilderness?
And especially when they got to the promised land, sending the spies came back and said, well, it's a wonderful land, but we can't take it. And the people complained, said, we want to get rid of them. It was sown. They're going to kill Moses and Aaron. We're going to appoint a captain and go back to Egypt where we were slaves. Talking about murmuring and complaining, an obvious example of it. Any other examples you can think of? I think of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, Numbers chapter 16, where they said, well, Moses and Aaron, you're taking too much on yourself to try to be the leaders of the people. We can lead too. And they just rebelled, and they were slain. So there's lots of examples of this problem of murmuring when the people of Israel didn't get what they wanted, and so they were punished. They were destroyed, it says, by the destroyer. In both of those cases that we just, all of them we just mentioned. Okay, so do you see an application of that to the Corinthians? Now, he doesn't specifically spell it out, but how might this apply to the Corinthians in their situation? Jerry?
Why should I have to give up my freedom because somebody else doesn't know what I know?
Yeah. And complaining about, I don't get my way. I think I should be able to go into the temple and eat that meat offered to the idol. And why are you telling me I can't do that? Now, he doesn't spell that out, but it seems to me, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that all this he's intending to apply, not just in general, but to the specific problem that he's dealing with. He's trying to get them to see you have an attitude problem of wanting to do what you want and say, you can't prove them in sin, so I'm going to do it. Never mind the fact that it hurts other people. Never mind the fact it puts me under all kinds of temptation. I'm going to do it. And Paul's trying to get them to see that that's the same problem the people of Israel had in the Old Testament. Okay? And what about us? Will we learn the problem, learn the lesson? Because that's the application now in verse 11. Okay? Questions, comments through verse 10. All right, so let's look at verse 11 then. And question number 9. Why does he say these lessons were written? Why are these things written? There's all these examples. They're written in the Old Testament. Why? Why did God write them down? Verse 11. Karen?
They were written for our admonition.
For us. Now, of course they were written for the people in the Old Testament too, but if the sins were committed and then God wrote it down, well, he wasn't writing it for the people who just committed the sin. They knew about it. He's writing about it for future generations, for people in the future to learn the lesson, including us, maybe hundreds of years later. It's an application for us to learn from that example. Okay? So, what are some lessons we should learn then? What does he say we should learn? What are some lessons we should learn from this? Sure.
This is kind of a side point from the matters of liberty in an idol's temple, but a lot of times today people say, well, the Bible is outdated and it's old and it doesn't really apply anymore. We don't need it at all, or we don't need it unless we modernize it and change things. But the Corinthians could have said that about Israel too. These stories are at least 1,400 years before them, and Corinth was a big, modern at the time city, very important, and a lot of people were rich, lived on the sea, whereas the Israelites were poor slaves wandering around in the wilderness. Completely different situation. But it didn't matter. God says the temptations they faced were the same temptations regardless of the situation, and the Corinthians needed to learn the lessons for the Israelites no matter how long ago that happened.
And so the Bible is relevant. Don't say it's not relevant just because it was hundreds of years ago or even thousands of years ago. The same lessons that these people needed to learn, we need to learn too. And the Corinthians need to learn them. What else can we learn? Any other lessons we can learn from these examples? All right, Frank, go ahead.
God is the same God today as he was then.
Look, yeah.
Precepts are the same.
Okay, we're under a different law, but it's still the same concept of if you're a covenant relationship with God, you have to keep the covenant. You have to do what he tells you to do. Yes, we have the New Testament, and we have some blessings and our privileges that they didn't have with the death of Jesus and so on, but it still comes down to if you want God to be pleased with you, you got to obey. You can't just do what you want and think it's going to work out. Okay? What else? Any other lessons we can learn, that we should learn here? Velma.
It teaches, knowing these things from the Old Testament teaches us how God deals with man's obedience and his disobedience.
Yes, obedience and disobedience. Okay? The time's almost up. Let me give you a few other things I think I see in this. First of all, look at the value of history. The Bible is a book of history. It's not just principles of right and wrong. It teaches us from history. Paul said that these things happened. That may seem a simple point, but Paul is saying this is real. This isn't myth. This isn't legend like some people say. The Bible is just a bunch of myths, a bunch of legend. No. Paul said these things happened. This is real history we're talking about here. Okay? And another lesson then, of course, we learn is the value of the Old Testament. We're not under the Old Testament, but there's still important lessons for us to learn. Jesus removed that law when he died on the cross, but there are still important lessons for us to learn here. And then another lesson is the record is accurate. It's been preserved. People say, well, it was all that changed over the years. You can't use the Bible anymore because it's been changed over the years. The record that Paul is referring to had to have about things happened hundreds of years before too, but he still could use it as authority because God had preserved it. And so Paul says the ages have come to people in his day, and now the word has come down through the ages to people in our day too. Same lessons that you and I need to learn as well. Okay, now next time, beginning of verse 12, we will focus on the summary of what this is about. Where is this? Verse 12. We'll talk about that next time. Questions, discussion before we close. Okay, thank you.